Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you very much for joining in today. After meeting after a couple of weeks break. So today would be our last discussion on this particular area. So the last session that I'll be having with you on this sustainable development module. So far we've been discussing about what the concept is, how it came to be, how it evolved over time, and the different components, different ways of looking at sustainable development. So today we'll go into the other side of things, the implementation side of things. So we know now what the problem is, then what can we actually do? And currently, what are we actually doing in terms of solutions, putting these concepts into practice? Okay, so let's go ahead and start then. Can you see the screen?
Yes, madam, we can see.
Recording in progress.
So today, as I was saying, we will look a little bit about how this concept that we've been discussing so far can be implemented in practice, the different policy instruments we use in the world today to put these ideas into practice, the different indicators that are being used to see how we are performing in terms of the targets we have set for ourselves. So when it comes to implementing sustainable development, it involves us taking some actions towards new ways, new patterns of development that are actually more sustainable. So this is a big challenge, isn't it? We so that normally we think of development in terms of maybe economic development or GDP growth, things like that. So thinking in terms of sustainable development is a bit of a challenge because it requires us to think in a little bit more broader way, taking into consideration the other aspects, social and environmental aspects associated with development as well. And taking these types of actions need parties at different levels, stakeholders at different levels. So from us as individuals to say community level or national government level and even global community level to get together and work together to put these ideas into practice. So here this word that we have to move towards new governance practices has been highlighted. So the difference here is, say, in the past, historically, usually these environmental problems, issues, they were looked at as national problems, things that national government should take care of. So not just environmental problems, even human development concerns. But now, with these international environmental problems, the problems that are affecting several countries in a global scale, and globalization, the dependence of our economies in how other countries are doing. Say if something happens in America, we say, okay, the dollar is appreciating like this. This is what's happening. Or something happens in the Middle East, it affects us. So even our economy, it's not something that is just dependent on our own actions only. So because of this, now there is a need to look at partnerships across countries, across communities, across different geographic areas when it comes to implementing sustainable development practices. So today, see, many of these actions that individual governments take, they are significantly shaped by various parties. Say there are lots of different international agreements. Say there are agreements on climate change, on, say, greenhouse gas emissions, waste management. So all those things affect our local level policies as well. And there are, say, today we are talking about IMF and all these conditions we have to fulfill and all those things. So again, our national level actions, they are affected by these financial institutions and even decisions of private business investors, corporations, activities of NGOs, different citizen groups. They can all have an impact on the policies, the actions that are taken at national levels to address these various issues. Right? So this governance involves this how we try to shape these processes by influencing how decisions are developed and what type of mechanisms are implemented in order to achieve sustainable development. Okay, so when it comes to governance, we kind of recognize that there is a range of different institutions, different rules, different participants, stakeholders that are interrelated and that we need to take into consideration when it comes to implementing sustainable development. So especially in a concept like sustainable development, this is important because many of these environmental problems we have discussed so far, they are affected by not just individual decisions, right? They're affected by decisions, behaviors at maybe local, regional, national, or even transnational levels, and they can have impacts across different spatial scales. So even the factors that cause these environmental problems, they are not just a single standalone cause. They can be interconnected, complex causes that result in many of these environmental problems. So to address those causes also, we need input actions from different levels of stakeholders. Okay, this is something from the news recently. Many of you might have already seen this. So these days, there's a very serious problem in New York in terms of air quality because of wildfires in Canada. So the problem, the cause is somewhere else, but the effect is felt in a different place. So again, there are different discussions about the causes for this problem. So some say it's because of poor forest management, others say it's the effect of climate change. So addressing those causes will require actions at different scales. So again, this is an example of those transnational, transboundary effects of many of these problems that we are facing today. So again, coming back to implementing sustainable development then, say in the middle of the last century, when we were recognizing many of these environmental problems that we were facing, what we now refer to as first generation environmental problems. So things like air pollution or water pollution within a single country. So those things were mainly addressed by national government.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think I got disconnected. Yeah, so as I was saying, so for these that type of these first generation environmental problems that are maybe that are particularly limited to a specific country, you can take that type of action. So top-down legislation, implementing some policies, some regulations about how businesses should operate, how industries should operate, limiting certain kind of activities, putting limits or standards on things that you can and do. So that was the main way of dealing with things. So this we refer to as a command and control approach to environmental policy. So the government issues some kind of a command in terms of a legislation, a law, or a mandate that you have to follow. And then you control to make sure that everybody follows that. But as these say in the last few decades after the 90s, we can see now people are starting to recognize the role that the private sector organizations can play and the markets can play in order to deliver environmental improvements. So you can provide some kind of incentives to, so rather than putting laws on everything, you're through market mechanisms. So maybe by giving an incentive or making something a bit more attractive in terms of imposing taxes or levies or giving subsidies, you can encourage people to do certain things. Encourage maybe individuals or even businesses to move towards more sustainable ways of doing things. And then even more recently, there are calls for, or there have been examples of hybrid government strategies. So it's a combination of both, where you kind of recognize the strengths and weaknesses of different organizations, mechanisms. When it comes to implementing sustainable development in isolation. And basically, the call is for combining all legislation, these market incentives, as well as our voluntary action, self-regulating activities to achieve sustainability. So it's not just laws telling us what to do, it's laws supported by market incentives as well as our self-regulation. So it doesn't matter what kind of laws there are about, say, polluting or putting garbage out. Say, what we see when people are driving on the road, they just throw whatever, say, plastic or the food wrapper that they've been using, isn't it? So a law might be there that you can't litter, but if you don't stick to it, if you don't have the self-regulation to do those things, no motivation to do those things, so it will be very difficult to actually achieve all these things in practice, isn't it? So, yeah, so to different types of instruments that instruments. So we have command and control instruments, and we have the market-based incentives in addition to self-regulatory actions. So these market-based incentives, they can involve, again, different things. And I'll quickly introduce some of these different methods we to practice of instruments. So these are basically the coercive regulations of behavior. So the government imposing a law or a mechanism. So they're kind of forcing businesses and individuals through legislation to do something. So basically what these laws will do is they will set a certain rule or a certain standard. Say it can be for pollution. So it can be for something like air pollution or water pollution or emissions. So there will be certain standards set. And if you beyond that target, then there'll be a sanction imposed on you. So this might, so to meet these targets, you might be required to install, say, a specific equipment or use specific types of equipment. So there can be different actions that you might have to do to meet these targets. So if there are targets about the level of pollution that can be in the water that you discharge into the river, then the businesses, the industries, they will have to take certain actions to purify, to maybe address that particular target. So it's basically command and control. It involves laws, mechanisms, measures that will be regulated through legislation. So you basically you're forcing people to practice or to meet certain standards, environmental standards. So this is a good example of a command and control type. So say when the scientists discover back in the 80s, high level that were immediately taken. That was taken was this Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layers, were taken back in 1987. So basically, what it was doing is this protocol. It was trying to regulate the production and consumption of nearly 100 man-made chemicals that were in the ozone layer. So those, say, so is the types of refrigerator in these types. So all these things were part of. Right. So again, the type of responsibilities that developing and developed countries, the level of responsibilities that developed and developing countries have are different. So there's the higher level of, maybe a quicker level of action is expected from developed countries, whereas developing countries have been given a little bit more time to phase out these substances. So everybody has an equal responsibility, but the how it's distributed is differentiated. And this has been quite effective now. So today, are saying that the ozone layer is actually recovering, right? So this command and control type actions, they can be quite effective, like if they are properly implemented. I will share a short small video with you today about this crossing the ozone hole, how the regulations have supported to do that.
Every day, as the sun shines on the earth, it sends ultraviolet rays that can cause sunburn and sometimes damage our DNA. Like a sunscreen for our planet, the ozone layer absorbs most of this harmful radiation and protects us. But in the early 1980s, scientists discovered that the ozone layer was thinning over Antarctica each August and September. In 1987, nations around the world came together to fix the problem through the Montreal Protocol. The international treaty banned the production of ozone-depleting chemicals like chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. But these chemicals had been in use for decades, and they stay in the atmosphere for a long time. So it took a while to see the effects of the ban. In 2000, the ozone hole was the largest ever observed by scientists. But conditions slowly improved. Data from NASA and several partners show a 20% decrease in ozone depletion during August and September from 2005 to 2016. In 2017, the hole is the smallest since 1988. A year later, the hole was smaller than expected. Studies suggest that the ozone layer over Antarctica should mostly recover by the middle of the 21st century.
So, so that was about regulation. So command and control type actions that we can take to address these issues, sustainability issues. Then moving on to market-based mechanisms that we can use. So one type of market-based mechanism that's currently used to address, again, environmental issues is this cap and trade type of instruments. So basically, what this is doing is you're setting a ceiling or a cap on a total amount of pollution that's allowed. But so you can do emissions within that capped amount. So what you can do to maintain that cap is you can actually trade your allowable emissions. So somebody's emitting more and somebody's emitting less, but has a allowance that they haven't used, you can trade. So you can trade emissions between countries, between industries, between businesses. So again, this is an instrument that's commonly used today, especially in the EU with their emissions trading scheme, again, to address some of these emissions targets. Okay, so I'll again share this short video explaining the EU, this trading scheme, emissions trading scheme that they're using and how they are using this cap and trade system over there.
In the products we buy, in the electricity. The Earth's climate is changing, and each one of us plays a role. In the products we buy, in the electricity we use, and in the energy that powers our businesses. Manufacturing, agriculture, transport, waste, power generation, and other sectors release carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, where they trap heat from the sun. But more carbon dioxide traps more of the heat, leading to global warming. The result? Changes in our climate, with ripple effects on weather, food production, water supplies, human health, and more. But there are smart ways forward. These include emissions trading, which is the cornerstone of the European Union's strategy to tackle climate change head-on. For more than a decade, the EU has worked to cut its greenhouse gas emissions with the help of the world's first, largest, and longest-running international system for trading emissions allowances. And the system keeps growing stronger. In a nutshell, the EU's emissions trading system, or ETS, creates a financial incentive for the biggest emitters to cut back. How? Well, since 2005, the ETS has set a cap on the total amount of greenhouse gases companies can emit each year and requires monitoring of these emissions. A fixed number of allowances, which are the currency of the carbon market, are issued, and each year companies hold enough allowances to cover their emissions or face significant fines. Don't have enough? Cut your emissions or buy extra allowances from another emitter. Have extra allowances? Keep them for next year or sell them. This flexibility ensures that emissions are cut where it costs the least to do so. Over time, the cap is reduced. Fewer allowances are issued, techniques to cut emissions are developed, and total emissions drop. Companies have a financial incentive to cut their emissions, or pay others to do so. Today, this cap and trade system covers around half the EU's emissions and more than 3/4 of the international carbon market. Interest is growing among business and government leaders around the world. The EU's ETS proves that putting a price on carbon is possible and makes economic sense. This flexible, cost-effective, and business-friendly approach is helping the EU move faster toward a low-carbon, greener future. Visit our website to find out more about how emissions trading works. Our future. The Earth's climate.
Okay, so that was about cap and trade. And then another common type of market-based instrument is imposing environmental taxes or pollution charges. So again, this is on what we discussed before, this polluter pays principle. So basically, you're trying to make the person that is responsible for the pollution actually pay the price. And so by imposing a tax or a pollution charge, you're trying to hold or trying to make sure that the price, the actual price that you pay for a good, it actually reflects the total cost of production, including any social cost or environmental costs. So say today we have certain taxes that are based on pollutant discharging certain pollutants. Say there can be taxes on leaded petrol, so airline flights. There are certain charges placed on users of certain activities. So for instance, London has a vehicle pollution tax. So you have to pay a tax to use your vehicle within the city. So you're paying for the pollution. Then there can be certain taxes and charges that are placed on use of harmful products. So, for example, the use of plastic bags in shops, or some, say, supermarkets in Sri Lanka are now implementing this as well. So you have to pay 5 piece or something, if you want to use a plastic bag, or they give you a small cup, if you bring your own reusable common instrument used for implementing these practices. Then governments also use subsidies to encourage certain actions. So say you might get certain grants or low interest loans or some favorable tax treatment if you do certain types of actions. So for instance, you might get low interest loans for implementing solar power systems in your home. Or you might get a certain grant to do a certain environmentally friendly action. So for instance, I think there are certain feed-in tariffs. And so if you use renewable energy, say if you're using solar power in your home, the electricity board, they might guarantee purchase of the extra electricity that you generate from your source. So there can be certain subsidies that help you to help to motivate people to take certain environmentally friendly actions as well. And then about legislation and market-based action, self-regulation actions as well. So as individuals, groups, or organizations, you take the initiative and you decide you're taking certain environment as good ecological citizens. Saying certain, say in coffee trading, say people use this fair trade labeling to ensure that it's coming from proper sources, that the farmers are paid properly, they are not being exploited. Things like recycling, voluntary conservation activities, responsible sourcing, certain garment factories. So I remember back in the day, Marks and Spencer in the UK, they were promoting their garment suppliers to undertake certain green actions. So many of the garments here in Sri Lanka that were supplying to them were required to make certain changes if they are to keep continuing supplying to them. So all of these can be voluntary or self-regulatory work that you voluntarily take in order to be good ecological citizens. So even things like paying your workers well, treating them well, looking after the health and safety of your workers, all that come under sustainability actions, not just the environmental aspects. So this just multiple common agreements between different countries that we have today that address certain environmental issues. So we have different treaties, which are basically international agreements that are between different governments that are governed by international law that kind of impose legal obligations on the parties that sign these treaties. So if you're party to such a international treaty, you have legal obligations to meet its conditions. So this makes you go beyond mere political law to do certain things. So these is a generic term that we use to maybe cap binding under international law that that are between two or more parties. So say there can be different terminology used. So people might call it an agreement, a convention, a protocol, treaty, but many of these would be things that are legally binding. And then on the other hand, there can be things called declarations. So I think the first time we met, we talked about the Rio Declaration. So this can be something that is not legally binding, but provides a interpretation or an understanding about a certain issue, that you agree to do something, but it might not be something that's always legally binding. So the Rio Declaration, for example, the 1992 Rio Declaration. So there are no legally binding obligations, but countries have declared certain aspirations, certain targets, goals in terms of sustainability that they would like to achieve. So we have numerous different environmental agreements today, now many of which are legally binding. So they address different aspects, or some are about protecting the global atmosphere, so preventing climate change or ozone depletion or things like that. Then there are others that are about conserving wildlife or biological diversity. And then there are others about managing oceans or the marine environment. Then there are regulations about these different areas. So some examples, so we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So something that has near convention. The main objective here is to stabilize or reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, prevent dangerous interferences to our climate system. So linked to the United Nations Framework Convention, we have a couple couple of international agreements. So we have the Kyoto Protocol, which committed the industrialized countries and economies to limit and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then this was further developed through the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. So we are put the nation into global temperature rise in this century below to um, I'm sorry about that. My internet connection is a bit weak today. I keep disconnecting, I think. Okay. So
Recording in progress.
Paris Agreement requires countries to submit plans for climate action every 5 years. So they have to, every country, including Sri Lanka, will have to submit nationally determined contribution. So we can decide as a country what we are going to do and submit our plans. So as of today, say that there is a gap between the levels of emissions that we should reach, that are projected to be reached in 2030, and the level that we are currently trying to, or that we are currently on the path towards. So if you are following our current policies, this is where we will end up at. And if we are to actually meet the target of keeping our temperature rise at 2 degrees Celsius, we have a big gap. So the current policies or our even now pledges, the things that we have countries have pledged to do, keep target of keeping the temperature rise below 2 degrees. And again, then there are other international conventions addressing biological diversity, Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. Again, Sri Lanka is a part of this. So the objectives here are about conserving biological diversity, sustainably using components of biological diversity, and fair and equitably sharing benefits arising out of using genetic resources. So related to this, there are a couple of protocols that have come out of that convention too. So one of that is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is basically an international treaty that governs the movement of LMOs, or living modified organisms, resulting from, say, modern biotechnology. If you're moving these things from one country to another, the treaty addresses that. So basically, what it's trying to do is trying to protect the biological diversity of individual countries from these genetically modified organisms. So, for example, there are lots of genetically modified crops today. So it could be tomatoes, cassava, corn, cotton, soybeans, so many modified crops. So to make them more productive, or to make sure that they are more resistant to pests or certain diseases. So this protocol basically addresses how you should handle, transport, use these genetically modified things to make sure that biological diversity is not affected. Then there's the UN Convention to combat desertification, addressing ecosystems and people are found. Then we have the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, so also known as the Ramsar Convention. This is one of the oldest intergovernmental environmental agreements, negotiated back in the 60s. So basically, parties to this Ramsar Convention, we are committed to wisely using our wetlands. So wetlands designate importance. So we have to make sure that these ones are effectively managed. So Sri Lanka, we have 6 such sites, 6 Ramsar sites that are designated as wetlands of international importance. So including places like Kumana, Boondala, Vilpattu, Madukanga, few such areas. Then there's the Basel Convention, again addressing, trying to protect human health and the environment against adverse effects of hazardous wastes. So basically, you're trying to combat toxic trade, where, say, some developed countries might dump toxic or hazardous waste in under country. So this Basel Convention, it aims to reduce generating hazardous waste and tries to promote environmentally sound management of these wastes wherever you're disposing them. Also, it's restricting transboundary movements of these wastes unless you're following certain proper management principles. So again, we are party to this convention, so there's a certain procedure you have to follow if you're transiting or shipping these types of waste through Sri Lanka. Again, I think you might remember again a few years ago, there was this huge brouhaha about discovering several containers of hazardous waste in the Colombo harbor, as I can remember. Right? There's the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, or the Haze Agreement. It's especially signed by parties of these Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, Singapore, to tackle haze pollution that are transboundary. So likewise, Sri Lanka is party to many different international conventions on environment, agreements, treaties, protocols, etc. So this is just some of that list taken from the customs website. So there are conventions on fishing, conservation of living resources, conventions about protecting workers against certain radiations. So many conventions, agreements, treaties that we have also agreed to follow and uphold. Okay, so shall we take a small break there then before continuing on? So it's 11:35. Shall we meet back in 20 minutes then? 11:55. Is that okay?
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. See you then back at 11:55.
Recording stopped.
Okay. So hope you're back.
Recording in
Welcome.
progress.
So then, when we are implementing sustainable development, the next step kind of that becomes important is how to assess whether we are doing it properly or how to assess whether we are meeting our goals. So we saw at the very beginning the concept of sustainable development people define in different ways. So there's no one universally agreed, like commonly identified definition. So because of this, when it comes to assessing whether something is sustainable or not, whether a development or whether a project is sustainable or not, it could be a bit of a challenging task. So when it comes to sustainable development, it's a complex term, open to different interpretations. So people might look at it in different ways, depending on their perceptions and how they look at a certain problem. So, for instance, even when you take a construction project, the aspects that are important for the client might not be the same aspects that are important to the contractor or the actual occupants of the building. So different stakeholders might have different priorities that they want addressed. So then the question becomes, so then is it something that we can't measure? Well, not really, right? Why do we need to measure something? So if we are to make right decisions, we need to have credible, accessible, timely information. So without information, without data, we might not be able to make the right decision at the right time. And also to make sure that when we have a goal, to ensure that we are actually achieving that goal or whether we are actually making any progress towards meeting that goal, we need to measure what is happening. We need to monitor our progress. So again, since many of you are from construction backgrounds, so you have progress meetings. You have to give progress reports. You measure it regularly to make sure whether you're meeting your time, cost, quality targets. Are you on budget? Are you on schedule? Or are you going over time on something? So if we don't measure, if we don't monitor the progress, then how do we know that we are on a road to meeting our goal? So another thing why it's important to measure something is, in general, it is our nature that we as people, we value things that we can measure. When we can see something, okay, our GDP is this much, or our something is this much. So when we can see, when we can quantify something, we might place a higher importance on those things. And then the other side of this is, it is important that we try to measure the things that we value as well. So if it's something that's important for us, it's something that it's important for us to achieve, then we have to try and see how we can measure whether we have actually achieved that or not, or whether we are on target to achieve those things or not. So even things like human aspects, people aspects, social aspects, trying to measure whether we are on route to achieving those things. So again, measuring things by developing indicators, it can also lead to, say, partnerships, reflection, dialogue, communication between different parties or stakeholders as well. So it could be different, say, community groups, businesses, organizations, governments. So it might require all these different groups to get together, have communication, have dialogue to ensure that you are achieving things. So when it comes to sustainability assessment in particular, back in November 1996, an international group of measurement practitioners and researchers from 5 different continents met in the city of Bellagio in Italy and developed a set of principles that can serve as guidelines for the assessment process. So basically, how you should choose, how you should design indicators, how you should interpret them, how you should communicate your results, everything. So basically, these principles, they have been intended for use in starting and improving assessment activities of the community groups, NGOs, corporations, national governments, international institutions, and things like that. So these are the 10 principles. They say you should start with the guiding vision, goal of what you want to achieve. So it's basically that will be the starting point of any assessment. So you have to establish a vision of sustainable development and have clear goals of what you need to achieve. And then when it comes to assessment, the principles say it needs to have a holistic perspective, need to have the essential elements, adequate scope, and practical focus. So basically, this deals with the content of any assessment. So you have to have a practical focus on the current priority issues. And then the process of assessment need to be open. You need to have effective communication and broad participation of different stakeholders. Then there should be the final 2 principles say any assessment process needs to be ongoing. So it should be a continuous process. And you need to continuously improve institutional capacity, the skills and capacities we need for the assessment as well. So as even those principles highlighted, having goals and indicators would basically serve as the starting point of any assessment process, including sustainability assessments. So a goal is basically what you want to achieve. So how can we measure whether you are progressing towards achieving your goal? That you can determine by using a group of indicators, measurable indicators. So indicator is basically a measure that will give you information on either the current state or the change in the system that you're measuring or the thing that you're measuring. So based on the 3 pillars concept, a sustainability indicator we can define as a measurable aspect of either the environment, economy, or the social system that we can use to monitor the change in these in the characteristics relevant to the continuous human environmental well-being. So something that we can use to measure the environmental, economic, or social system condition of the change in condition. So why then we need indicators? So when we have indicators, we can assess conditions. We can check conditions. What is the current situation? What is the status? How are we doing? We can check historical trends during the past 10 years. How have we been doing? Is there an improvement? Or have we been doing better or worse? And when we have that kind of information, we can have it can kind of serve as an early warning system. So when we see certain trends, when we see how we are doing in terms of certain indicators, we have information. And we can try and prevent the adverse outcomes proactively. And when we have indicators, what we can also do is we can benchmark against other systems. Say we can compare countries, we can compare industries, we can compare businesses, different companies together. We can do that kind of benchmarking when we use certain indicators, common indicators, to measure things. Also, it becomes easier to communicate ideas. So rather than saying we need to implement social sustainability, when you have certain indicators, certain targets that we have to achieve, it's easier to communicate. It's clearer what exactly we need to aim for. So it can also then support decision making. And what are the exact decisions we need to take to address these particular targets, to make sure that we are reaching these goals? So we can then make appropriate strategies and track progress. So there are certain characteristics of good indicators. One is they have to be relevant. It reflects the interests of your target audience, the important opportunities, addresses the social, environmental, economic aspects. They are clear, comprehensible, and transparent. So they become actually meaningful. They can actually mean something for the intended audience. They are usually also objectives in terms of measurement techniques and verifiability. That means usually you would be able to quantify and objectively measure these things. They also need to be practical in that they are cost effective and non-burdensome when it comes to implementation. So if they are not practical, so if they become very, say, a big burden to implement, then their usefulness will be lost. They should also be actionable. That means that they're practical things that you can actually take practical steps to address. And they should also be durable, that they need to be relevant in the long term as well. So these indicators are commonly used when we discuss about implementing sustainable development. So, for instance, today many businesses around the world, they use something called triple bottom line accounting or this global reporting initiative or GRI. So to report not just on their economic performance in a particular year, but also their performance in relation to social environmental goals. So say companies report on their CSR activities, how they have implemented certain environmentally friendly practices and all those things. So say having high quality sustainability indicators and reporting on these indicators, it is now recognized as something that is important for both companies to communicate that they are committed to sustainable development and also to performance of organized sustainable the United Nations Development Goals. They have indicators for each of these goals as well. I can, so for example, so this is from the from our local website statistics.gov.lk about the Sustainable Development Goals. So based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so we discussed or we introduced these 17 Sustainable Development Goals last time that the United Nations, the UN has developed. So say for each of these goals, so these are the 17 goals. So end poverty in all its forms everywhere, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Likewise, so there are 17 goals. So for each of these goals, there are targets you have to achieve. So for goal 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. These are the targets that have been set. So by 2030, you have to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $25 a day. So likewise, there are specific targets for each of these goals. So for making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, which is the 11th goal. These are the targets that have been set. By 2030, ensure access for all to adequate and safe, affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. By 2030, enhance inclusive and sustainable urbanization and capacity for participatory, integrated, and sustainable human settlement planning and management in all countries. Strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So those are the targets that we have to aim for under each of these goals. But then how do we know whether we are reaching these targets? So we have 190 something countries in the United Nations. How do we know? Now, Sri Lanka, we have agreed to work towards these targets. So how do we know that we are making progress? Or how do we know where we are doing well and where we are not doing well? How do we know how we compare with other countries? And how do we then find out how the world as a group, how we are doing? So for this, we have the indicators, right? So for each of these goals, then there are specific indicators. So for target 1, 2030, ensure access for all to adequate. Then how can we check that? The indicator is proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements, or adequate housing. So what's the proportion of your urban population that's living in slums? And then for target 5, by 2030, significantly reduce the number of deaths and the number of people affected, and substantially decrease the direct economic losses relative to global gross domestic product caused by disasters, including water-related disasters, with a focus on protecting the poor and people in vulnerable situations. How can we measure that? How can we check whether we are achieving that? The first indicator is the number of deaths, missing persons, and persons affected by disaster per 100,000 people. Then direct disaster economic loss in relation to global GDP. That's the second indicator. So likewise, for each and every target, there is one or more indicators that you can use to measure whether how you are doing. So for goal 9, building resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. So here are the targets. And again, the specific indicators we can use to measure. Okay, so that is again then a good example, the Sustainable Development Goals, where you have specific goals, targets, and then indicators to measure whether we are achieving those targets. So for target 9.1, developing sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructures, one indicator that they have is road access for rural population. So how do you measure that? The proportion of the rural population who live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. So they are very objective. You can quantify those things. Leaders development is a long-standing requirement in many countries process that we use. So I think you'll discuss this with Professor Lalit De Silva today also. So in Sri Lanka, we have introduced the EIA process in the National Environmental Act. But I think over here it's mandated only for large-scale development projects or projects which are located in environmentally sensitive areas. So there are certain steps that you have to follow in order to undertake an EIA process. So many of these bilateral doing certain things, these companies like the World Bank or the IMF, they have requirements for certain sustainability assessment or environmental assessment to be undertaken before you implement projects. So we are also trying to say globally move from just environmental impact assessment to say more holistic sustainability assessment as well. So basically making sure that we are not only looking at environmental aspects, but also making sure that our plans and activities make a contribution towards sustainable development, the social and the social aspects as well. And the key thing is now the focus is not just on minimizing negative effects, but also encouraging positive steps towards say enhancement of the current situation. Making sure that we have a future that's more viable, pleasant, and secure. So if you look at it in a different way, so we are trying to move from just focusing on, say, offsetting negative impacts to reducing them, say, eliminating impacts over time, and then to rectify them, to minimize them altogether by limiting the severity of those impacts, or then to avoid the impact altogether, and finally to enhancing things. So if we look at this in terms of biodiversity conversation, say at the bottom levels, you might be trying to say compensate for features that are lost by carrying out the development. So that might be how you try to reduce, offset, or rectify what you're doing. And then when you move up the hierarchy, you can try to avoid the impacts altogether by, say, avoiding developing in sites or areas that can have key adverse impacts. Say again, a few years ago, there was this huge discussion about people trying to develop in say protected forests here, that you're building a road through Sinharaja, or you have given this space of land to build a hotel within Sinharaja and all those things. So avoid would involve trying to avoid those adverse impacts on species, on biodiversity maybe, by not doing those activities. Whereas enhance would be you're trying to enhance the overall quality by maybe creating new habitats, creating new buffer areas, or certain landscape features. So you are adding to the existing condition. You're actually enhancing, making the existing condition even better. So when we are talking about these sustainability assessments, especially in projects, so it can happen in two ways. There can be internal assessment. So as a developer, as a client, you might undertake your own sustainability assessment of your own project. So it's a proactive thing. You do it because you want to undertake a sustainable, environmentally, socially responsible project. Then there are these external assessments. So it could be EIAs, environmental impact assessments, and all these other external assessments that regulators do, external parties do, which can basically check whether our project is sustainable or not. So you're talking about all these green building assessments, LEED, and all those things. So those can be external assessments as well. So together, these assessments can lead towards sustainable outcomes. So as we were saying now, the idea is to develop these EIA, the environmental impact processes, even further to make them into sustainability assessment processes. So rather than just limiting to project level, applying it only to individual project proposals, extending those fully to address overall holistic sustainability issues. So these are actually practiced in several countries around the world. So in Hong Kong, for instance, they use or they apply sustainability assessment when evaluating urban infrastructure options, infrastructure projects. The UK uses sustainability appraisal, especially when it comes to regional planning. And in Namibia and South Africa, they have tried to use sustainability-centered planning and assessment processes, especially in relation to mining operations. And then with the World Conservation Union and the Forest Stewardship Council, they have put in place certain sustainability-based processes relevant to forest managements and how you certify forest products, timber products, and things like that. So those are actual examples of these things being used in practice. And then another well-known use of an indicator is this ecological footprint concept, or even the carbon footprint concept. So ecological footprints basically where you are trying to measure our human impact on the environment. So you're trying to quantitatively assess the total resources, biophysical resources that are needed to support the consumption activities of a particular group of people. So it could be people in a country or the world as a whole. So basically how much raw materials, energy is needed to produce, transport the goods that that group of people consume, usually within a year. So typically this is expressed in terms of hectares of biologically productive area. So how much hectares, for how much land area basically is needed to supply these goods that we consume. So if you go to this website, the Footprint Network website, you can find data in relation to this. You can see many countries in the world, the ones in red, they are consuming more than they have actually. So even us, you can see Sri Lanka, we are in red. So we have a biocapacity deficit. So the countries with the highest deficits, so countries like Singapore, Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, basically the consumption is more than what is physically available to them. Then there are other countries with a biocapacity reserve, where their consumption is actually lower than the resources they countries like African Republic, Congo. So in a country basically means demand things through so trees can
Recording stopped.
Sorry about that.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, so us in Sri Lanka, we are the same. So in terms of our demand for the goods, services, things like fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, things that we consume, wood, our cotton for clothing, our need for carbon absorption, all those things are more than what our own ecosystems can regenerate. So how we meet this deficit? So when we don't have this capacity in our own country, so when we need more things, what happens is we are importing things, or we are liquidating our ecological assets. That means we are overusing things like overfishing, or overusing our cutting down our forests faster than they can regenerate, emitting more carbon into the atmosphere than what the atmosphere can process, or putting out more pollutants into the environment than what exceeding what the environment can safely process. So that is where we are currently. So we looked at this a couple of sessions ago as well, the idea of this overshoot day. It's basically means the day in the year where we finish using the resources that are available for us, and that day has been getting closer and closer over the years. So in the 1970s, for instance, the overshoot day was at the very end of the year, towards the end of December. Whereas now, I think it was somewhere in July last year. In the middle of the year, by the middle of the year, we have used all the resources that the earth can regenerate. And after that, we are basically in deficit. So we are basically polluting or overfishing, over-consuming things, and putting things out into the environment that that our ecosystem cannot handle, cannot process. So it's carbon footprint, the idea, it's something similar to the ecological footprint. It's measuring in terms of your carbon emissions. Then another use of indicators, this Happy Planet Index report, that's something that is reported for countries worldwide since 2006. It's done by the New Economics Foundation. So they are taking this ecological footprint concept, and they are also considering the efficiency with which these ecological resources that people use are converted into actual human development outcomes. So whether you're actually using your resources in an efficient way, so that they are actually contributing towards human development. So whether things like your life expectancy, life satisfaction, whether that type of things have improved by your use of resources. So the Happy Planet Index, they are basically multiplying life satisfaction by the average life expectancy and dividing that by the ecological footprint of each country. to come up with the index. Show how efficiently you are using your resources. So basically, this one is highlighting that you can actually live long, happy lives, high life expectancy and high satisfaction with actually small ecological footprints. So you can see many of the highest consuming nations like the USA, the UK or Germany or China, they are not high on the Happy Planet Index. Countries like Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic, they are much higher. So I will not play this video right now because of, I think, with my connection issue. So I will share it on Moodle with you all. So it's a TED Talk developed by an economist, again, about a particular index called the Social Progress Index that you can use to measure whether you're actually on the path to achieving sustainable development. So likewise, there are lots of various indices currently used when we are discussing about sustainable development. So the UN has the Human Development Index, the World Conservation Union, they have something called the Well-being Index. And the Economic Forum, they have an Environmental Sustainability Index. There's the Living Planet Index that's used by the WWF. Then Dow Jones, they have a Sustainability Index family. But again, now the criticism is that none of these indices have been developed as comprehensive indices of sustainable development. So they might not fully address all three pillars equally, environmental, economic, and social pillars equally. So some might be looking more at environmental issues, so things like the Living Planet Index, for instance, might be more about the environmental aspects. The Human Development Index might be more about the social aspects. So there is that a lack of one index that is addressing all three pillars in an equal way. So this is the actual challenge that we have when it comes to measuring how we are doing in terms of sustainable development. So one key challenge is that the sustainability, it's a holistic concept. So there are many interdependent dimensions. So something that we do to address a social aspect might have environmental impacts. Something that we do to enhance our economic aspect will have social and environmental impacts. So things are interconnected. So when we break things down to say individual measures, individual environmental measures, social measures, economic measures, then how can we capture these interconnections? How can we capture the trade-offs? So when we try to protect the environment, we might be losing out on an economic aspect. Or when we are trying to address a social concern, we might lose out on an environmental aspect or an economic aspect. So how can we address these trade-offs? That's a challenge that many people face when it comes to implementing sustainability. Then another concern people has is what time scale to use when it comes to assessing sustainability. So we talk about intergenerational issues not harming our future generations. So how far should we look at? Is it the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? So what is the correct time scale to use? And then there are certain aspects of that or certain characteristics that the process of moving towards sustainable development should have. So, for example, we talked that there should be involvement or participation of different stakeholders or different governance levels. I say it could be community level, different businesses, NGOs, individuals, national governments, all those different levels of governance. So how do you assess those things, whether the actual process that you're following to implement or move towards sustainability, it's proper or not? And then there are qualitative aspects of sustainable development. Say things like quality of life, well-being. So how do you then measure those things? Or things like justice, equity. So are those things that you can accurately measure? Especially with the different perspectives or different interests of parties in relation to sustainable development. Then how do we decide what to actually implement, where to put the priorities on? So all those things are questions that people currently have when it comes to implementing or putting these ideas into practice. So I think last time we talked about different, say, conceptualizations of sustainable development, and one of them was this capitals model of sustainability. So in there, this idea of addressing trade-offs, they look at it in a certain way. So in that model, the question is, will it still be sustainable if you allow some forms of capital to deteriorate while you maintain other forms of capital? So you're basically checking whether these different forms of capital, whether they are substitutable or not. The things that we produce as the manufactured capital, can we substitute that for natural capital? So we use natural capital to produce things. So from the things that we produce, can we substitute? Can they be used as substitutes for the natural capital that we used? So based on your idea, based on what you, whether you say yes or no to that question, you can see where in the spectrum of sustainability that you fall in. So you can have very weak sustainability to very strong sustainability. The difference is in weak sustainability, you're only saying only the total level of overall capital matters. So whatever the man-made or manufactured capital, you can use as a substitute or alternative to the natural capital, the natural ecological resources that you use up in producing those things. So what you're passing on to the future generation is that total capital stock. So in the very weak forms of sustainability, any form of natural capital is thought as can be traded off or substituted by human or man-made capital. On the other hand, in strong sustainability, you recognize there are certain natural resources that you actually cannot replace by manufactured capital. So it might be certain biological resources, or could be maybe the ozone layer, or there can be certain resources that are recognized as non-substitutable. You cannot replace those things with what we produce, what we manufacture. So what many ecologists or environmentalists say is that there are certain forms of this natural capital. If you lose them once, they are lost forever. You cannot bring them back. So there are certain species, maybe, if they go extinct, they are gone forever. You cannot recreate them. So likewise, this capital's model of sustainability, they argue that you can have a spectrum of different levels of sustainability. From very weak sustainability, where basically you think that you can substitute any form of natural capital by human-made capital, to very strong sustainability, where you cannot allow any man-made capital to be substituted for any natural capital. So basically it's impractical. Impractical. So you cannot use any natural resource at all, because then that will get depleted and the stock level will go down. So within those two extremes, you have these different forms of sustainability. So you have moderate, strong sustainability, where you are allowed to deplete or use up certain amounts of natural capital if you are able to compensate that with some form of human-made capital. So for example, you can invest the income that you get from exploiting oil reserves to develop renewable energy sources. So that can be considered as moderate, strong sustainability. And so just to wrap up our discussion on sustainable development, then there are lots of criticisms about this concept. So these are just some of these things. So this Redcliffe, he says, so like motherhood or like God, it's difficult not to approve of the concept of sustainable development, but at the same time, there are lots of contradictions associated with this concept. Then say there are other people that says today this sustainable development, it has become an overused, misunderstood phrase. So people just use the term to maybe as businesses to get more consumers or to show that they are say environmentally conscious or socially responsible or something like that, without really understanding what that concept is about. So again, then there are others that say it's a contestable concept where people can argue over. So there are conflicts around how what sustainable development means or how it should be implemented, what should be prioritized, and all those things. So this is one such criticism today, this idea of greenwashing, where many companies are, say, claiming to do things, claiming to be sustainable, claiming to do certain actions, but in actual practice, in actual reality, might not be as sustainable as they claim to be. So share this video with you.
Sustainable, eco-conscious, made from recycled materials. Companies are using phrases like these more and more frequently today. Sales of consumer packaged goods advertising sustainability in North America rose by over 30% in just 5 years, reaching an estimated $268.9 billion in 2022. And more than 60% of consumers say they'd pay more for a product with sustainable packaging. But underneath the flashy buzzwords, companies can fall short of their eco-friendly promises. Environmental activists say an ongoing legal battle with H&M might highlight a big company's alleged greenwashing. That's when companies mislead consumers with promises of being more eco-friendly than they actually are. In 2022, a class action lawsuit claimed that the clothing retailer's Conscious Choice collection advertised itself as sustainable, but it was actually not made from sustainable and environmentally friendly materials. The case is still ongoing, and H&M says it's taking these allegations very seriously, is looking into them thoroughly, and that its sustainability work has never been about greenwashing. Here's how a lack of transparency with consumers, long timelines, and weak environmental goals can all be signals of greenwashing. Greenwashing is when a company or organization uses misleading advertising to market itself as more environmentally friendly than it really is. Sustainable ESG funds, or investments that consider environmental, social, and corporate governance factors, have exploded over the past decade, exceeding $350 billion in net assets in 2021.
It's becoming increasingly profitable for companies to be seen as being beneficial to the environment. Consumers are increasingly demanding sustainable products. Investors want to invest in companies that have lower carbon footprints.
So why do people criticize greenwashing?
When you buy from a company that is engaging in greenwashing practices, you are encouraging that behavior to continue. Other companies will take note.
Some companies say their sustainability efforts are better than doing nothing. But critics would argue greenwashing involves weak goals, lack of transparency with consumers, and long timelines. Take one common corporate environmental promise: reducing carbon emissions. One way companies say they reduce their emissions is by purchasing carbon offsets. A carbon offset is an action or activity that balances the emission of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's a buyable, sellable, and tradable commodity. In theory, when a company buys a carbon offset, it finances an action that removes greenhouse gas emissions from the air, like planting trees or building renewable energy projects. This is supposed to balance the overall amount of carbon dioxide a company puts into the atmosphere.
Carbon offsets and carbon credits have become an incredibly controversial mechanism in the fight against climate change. And activists and environmentalists claim, and our reporting shows, many of these projects are generating credits, too many credits, and not really reducing or removing emissions that companies are paying for.
Critics say carbon offset goals are weak and that companies aren't transparent with consumers about how they'll achieve them. While companies can claim they're putting money towards carbon offsets, the offset's environmental impact isn't always clear to consumers. Plus, activists say companies have decades-long timelines to reach their goals. A company can promise to achieve zero emissions by 2050, but if it doesn't have intermediary goals, it's unclear when it will actually start reducing emissions. And time is essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's because the United Nations Paris Agreement calls for global emissions to be reduced by 45% by 2030, in order to keep global temperatures from rising by no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So who is policing greenwashing companies?
When a company does engage in greenwashing, the negative outcomes for them are quite limited. In the worst case, it might be a fine at this point.
In 2022, Goldman Sachs' asset management arm paid millions after violating SEC compliance rules with ESG fund marketing. Goldman neither admitted nor denied the SEC's allegations. But there's increased efforts by governments to start cracking down on greenwashing companies. In March, the European Union rolled out a series of proposals which would require companies to back up their products' environmental claims with scientific evidence. These claims would then need to be independently verified. This is part of a larger effort to make it easier for consumers to choose sustainable products. There are roughly 450 million people in the European Union. Regulations adopted there often lead to larger changes globally, since multinational companies prefer not to work with different sets of rules around the world. And there's movement in the US as well. The Federal Trade Commission is discussing rules that would regulate environmental marketing claims. It also wants to penalize companies for each time a product uses deceptive language. And the SEC is proposing new disclosure and naming requirements for ESG funds.
Yeah, so that's the downside of things, or the criticisms regarding what people are doing in terms of sustainable development. Then there are arguments to the other side as well. So, say when people are saying that this is a vague concept, that vague concept, there's no universal agreement as to what's the definition of sustainable development. So, say that other people say, then that can be an advantage as well. So when there's vagueness, when there's ambiguity, there will be lack of tension. So you're not trying to force people to do one specific thing. So you can actually adapt it as suitable to a specific context. So, say in other words, people say it's actually sustainable development can be attractive precisely because it can be interpreted in different ways. So when we have that diversity, that flexibility, to look at it from different perspectives, view it from different perspectives, we can bring together different groups to one place, different groups that might have incompatible interests, various different interests, to sign up to one concept and put in place practical initiatives and causes. So there are both advantages and disadvantages associated with this vagueness. So you can see this is actually taken from research by Hopwood et al., where they have looked at how different people look at sustainable development and what sort of actions that they call for. And they have identified actually there are three broad views as to the nature of changes that are necessary to achieve sustainable development. So what sort of changes people call for? There are some that say that what we are doing now, the status quo, is enough to achieve sustainability. Say within our current structures, the mechanism systems that we have today, we can actually achieve sustainability. And then there are others that say that we need certain reforms, fundamental reforms. So we don't need to fully get rid of our existing systems, the legislations, laws, the governance systems, but we need certain changes, certain reforms to those systems in order to achieve sustainable development. Then on the other hand, the third group, they say that no, that's not possible. We actually need a transformation. See, but these parties, what they suggest is that actually the current problems that we have, they actually come from the way we are doing things now, the structures, the governance systems, the political systems, structures of society. So if we are to achieve sustainability, then we are going to need radical transformations. So we might need to uproot our current systems and totally transform them into more sustainable mechanisms. So those are three approaches that different groups have suggested. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to show this to you as well. This is an actual case study where since we were discussing about these trade-offs when it comes to addressing sustainable development. It's a case from Australia, in Western Australia. So they have identified that a particular area was suitable for exploiting gas, natural gas. But the problem was the only viable site or the location that they can have this gas processing facility was on an island nature reserve, which had irreplaceable ecological value. So you have ecological objectives, the value of the reserve, the ecological value of the reserve, as opposed to the economic advantages you get from having the gas field. So while they say during the project assessment, they considered sustainability objectives. So the government authorities say that they hoped, yes, there are environmental offsets that you're using out on ecological sites, there are environmental impacts, but they'll be balanced out by whatever the economic gains that you can get. So the point here is that at the end of the day, when you can't find adequate offsets, adequate ways of, say, offsetting the environmental or social impacts that you're doing, usually the economic side end up being prioritized. So that's how usually the decision making happens still. So usually the environmental social aspects, they they are not given as much importance as the economic priorities still in the world today when it comes to actual ground level decision making. So even though the theory is that we need equal attention to be given to economic, social, and environmental aspects, in theory, when it comes to sustainable development, usually what happens in practice is like this. Highest priority is usually given to economic aspects. Maybe then you give some attention towards social aspects, and maybe the environment ends up being the least prioritized. So the change that we need is to expand these two circles, the environmental and social circles, to have the same level of priority as economic aspects. So when you are evaluating a project, you look at all three aspects equally. So any questions, comments before we wrap up?
Recording stopped.
Okay, so if there are no questions, we'll stop there. I'll be uploading the lecture notes to Moodle, so you can get them from there. And thank you very much. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
I'll be stopping the meeting here.